Hey, welcome to part 2 of our CAN bus wideband installs. If you didn't already check out part 1, you might want to take a look at that first. It goes over the theory and how they work and a lot of the configurations and why I chose to use them on this project. For part 2 today, we're going to actually go through the install, and towards the end, we'll go through a couple more configurations that are needed. So let's jump right into it. All right, let's get this thing backed out so we can start working on the exhaust. Oh, I was waiting for it to prime, but it sounds like the pumps just run endlessly. Oh, that's kind of rough. Needs a little tuning work. Hell yeah, love these quick jacks. Looks like he's got Cook's long tubes in here, which have a bung in them already. But I know from working with Cook's in the past, when you open this up here, if you put a sensor in here, it only feeds this one tube. In other words, you get a single cylinder per side it catches. And whoever did this install already knew that, because I can see they welded in a bung just back here. I probably would have liked to do it a little closer, but that's splitting hairs. Really, they did the right thing. They put a bung here, and they did the same thing here, and they put the narrowband sensors, which is great because I was getting ready to pull this mid-pipe off to weld some bungs on to put the widebands in, but I'm going to steal these two because we no longer need narrowbands. And then I'm going to go ahead and feed this up and through likely the transmission tunnel shifter area, get it up behind the dash where we can do the wiring. While I'm under here, I was looking at the cooling system and I can see it looks like these fittings here, or something along that line, is leaking. Fluid's coming out, but even worse, what I'm noticing is this goes towards the front of the car, and there's the EMP pump. I have not tested this car specifically, but I've played around with EMP pumps enough to know that this is going to cavitate the instant you accelerate forward. Fluid, it needs to be sitting, down, back at an angle. Fluid needs to go back. These things are very sensitive to cavitating. There's no way that's going to work. Okay, I've been trying to figure out what all these switches here do, and I went ahead and got this pulled up and flipped over, and it turns out 3 of the 4 aren't even in use, so there must have been for some future projects that were coming along. There is one in use. I'm going to have to trace these wires and figure out what exactly it does. Looks like we got a little terminal breakout block here, which might be coming quite handy. Looks like we got a ground and positive. There's a nice grommet here, which was pretty neat, so I can feed through the wideband connections pretty nicely. I can get this old wideband stuff out. Probably going to remove this guy here and these 2 over here, and we'll get the new widebands installed. So basically it's just wiring and feeding wires right now, so we'll get to it. Okay, I'm pulling everything apart here. All these gauges out, pulling these panels out, and that's because I'm finding random USB cables, a couple of them hanging out of here, and just random wires and connections all over. Okay, driver's side kick panel. Looks like we found a few more interesting things. I believe this to be a hub switch, what looks like the controller for the Aeroforce gauges, and all the cables that come out of it for the gauges that go up there. Of course, this is all ODB2 powered and reads all of its information from the ODB2 port, and since we're pulling the stock ECU out, none of this will work anymore anyway, so it's all coming out. Wow, that's cool. For some of the OG guys that have been around a while, you'll recognize that's a lean protection module. That's something I designed, manufactured, and sold years ago. That is so cool to find in a car. It is all plugged in and in use as well. Wow, well that just made my day. How cool is that? Unfortunately, all the features in this, for those not familiar, essentially it monitors your throttle position, and when you're getting into wide open throttle boost conditions, it's checking your air-fuel ratio, and you could actually hook it up to your computer with a USB cable and pre-program parameters on how it behaved, but essentially it would cut spark and save you from blowing your motor if you ran lean for whatever reason. All the functionality that's in here is actually duplicated in the MS3 standalone. So I'll throw it in the back seat for Dan, and he could sell it to someone with a stock ECU. Okay, another interesting surprise. What I think is a hub switch for a fuel pump to kick on. It does go run back here. So I go back to trace it, get back here to the trunk, and I see he does have this 4 controller, the FC3. It's pretty nice. And I'm looking down and, oh, what do I see? One of my fuel pump modules. I made these years ago as well. I actually didn't make these for very long. I'm kind of surprised to see one in this car. But what this does, it monitors the mass airflow sensor, and only when the first pump is completely exhausted would it turn on your second fuel pump. So the idea is you could go wide open throttle in first, second, and usually about halfway through third is when it would run out. That way you didn't have the second fuel pump kicking on, based on boost. Otherwise, every little blip of the gas pedal and it's just kicking on and off constantly. This issue alleviated it. Unfortunately, once again, an obsolete part. The MS3 has that kind of functionality built right into it. So we'll pull that out. All right, day 1 down. And this is all the stuff we got out, all this wiring, old sensors, old wideband sensor, all this wiring, pillar, lean protection module, ODB2 stuff, air force gauges. There's still a lot more to pull out, but this is a good start. Okay, so you might be wondering, why are we back in the trunk messing with the fuel pump wiring on a wideband install? And that's because I normally trigger the wideband to power up from the fuel pump relay, so it's only running when the engine's running. 2 main reasons for that. First one, I learned the hard way many years ago. That's when you key on and you just leave it like that. Maybe you're messing with a tune, maybe you're getting a wheel alignment, something else. The heater on the wideband draws so much power, it's like usually 3 or 4 amps, it'll drain your battery fairly quickly and you'll need a jump start. Been there, done that. The second reason is the heater element heats up the center of that sensor really, really hot, and it's a very sensitive porcelain piece. And what happens is when you start a cold engine and you let it sit there with key on and you've waited for that wideband to get really, really nice and hot, when that cold engine starts, it spits out bits of moisture in the exhaust. Cold piece of moisture hits that really hot ceramic and it can crack it. Ruins a wideband sensor real quick. It's much better to wait till the engine actually fires and it's spitting all that moisture and getting that going, and then the wideband slowly heats up in that condition and surpasses. It lasts so much longer. Now I know there are fancier OEM widebands that key on, they don't actually heat up the center porcelain all the way till the engine's actually running, and you don't have to go through that process. You can just key on power them. But in the aftermarket world, this usually works the best. Unfortunately, on Dan's car, as soon as you turn the key on, the fuel pumps just run continuously. So it eliminates that option. Now I could trigger them by the MS3 and put some smart logic in there for when I want the widebands to turn on. It just seems overkill and cumbersome for this setup. I mean, I've done it on other cars, but there's really no need if you can just trigger it off the fuel pump relay. So let's fix that wiring first, get that working, and then we can wire up the wideband. Make sure the next guy that works on this doesn't want to hang himself trying to figure out the wiring. Okay, before I tidy all this up and pack it away and you can't see anything, I'll show you there's 2 widebands are over here. Both plugged into their O2 sensors, which of course are installed in the car. I have a relay here, which we're going to tuck back there, and it has power for the widebands. It has key on power. But what I decided to do was, this relay is, although it has key on power, the ground to it is over here. And I'm going to feed this to the optional controller on the MS3. And then of course is the CAN high and low wires. Can't finish it yet. We're going to install the MS3 and then we're going to wire that up. And this will allow the MS3 to trigger the widebands whenever we want. I decided to just do that. It's kind of a neat way to do it, and I can show you guys how that works and what options you have. It's kind of cool. So we will wrap this up in the next video when we have the MS3 on there. Sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words, so let me show you how I wired up the CAN bus widebands and how I'm using the MS3 to control it. It can be a little bit confusing because the MS3 uses ground outputs. And it's the exact opposite of what most people think. You think of an output as supplying 12 volts to turn something on, but instead it supplies a path to ground to turn on your circuit. So over here we have our battery and it's supplying 12 volts down to our relay, which is wanting to send power to the wideband. But the relay cannot turn on until it gets a ground. So you turn on your key or you have the engine running, and when the MS3 decides, okay, I want to turn the widebands on, it then completes this circuit to ground, snapping on the relay and sending power to the wideband. That's how a ground output circuit works. So using this type of circuit, now the MS3 is in control of when our widebands turn on. So we can go into the Tuner Studio software and configure the MS3 to turn them on under whatever conditions we desire. So we could say the engine should have started and be running for at least X number of seconds. You could even specify like the engine reaches a certain temperature if you wanted. Your imagination is the only limitation here. For all practical reasons, I'm probably going to do a small delay of 10-15 seconds, just enough for the engine to start up and get that moisture spit by, let the sensor start heating up and then come to life. Okay, following that wiring diagram, I'm going to show you how to configure the Tuner Studio side of it. So we're going to go up to Advanced Engine, Programmable On-Off Outputs 1, and I know I wired it into the high current output 1 on the MS3. And you can give that a more friendly name so it makes more sense to you. We'll call it wideband power. And now it's enabled wideband power. We'll enable that option. Power on value is when you key on, it'll be off. Active value is when these conditions are met, it'll turn on. So we have RPM greater than 300 and a hysteresis of 50 to prevent flapping should, car be surging or something down here. That's great. That means a key off, it'll be on, but when the engine's actually running, the wideband will be turned on. But we don't want it to turn on instantly, so we can add an additional condition. We'll say and. TPS, no, let's go with seconds, time. Greater than 10. There, perfect. So now this tells me our wideband power, when RPM is greater than 300 and 10 seconds have passed, turn on. Perfect. And I wanted to show you another little configuration just in case. This could be turned off and may mess some people up from the first video where I showed the CAN bus configurations. There's a CAN EGO option there, and you do need to make sure this fetch EGO data is on. I kind of assumed it in the first video, but make sure if that's disabled, that's not going to work for you. Make sure that's on generic. And something else while we're here I can show you is the calibration of the wideband itself. And this is not CAN specific. You do this for any wideband. Calibrate AFR table. And what this does is it's actually going to write it to the firmware of your ECU. It's not part of the tune. So you go in here and you find your particular wideband. In our case, we had the Zoetronics linear wideband. If you don't see your wideband in the list, you can select custom and you can just input the values manually. Make sure you're actually plugged into the car with the key on, hit right to controller, and it'll flash those settings. So there you have it. Hope you guys have enjoyed this CAN bus wideband series. Next time we see Project Redfire, it'll be to install the MS3 standalone ECU. So make sure you hit subscribe. You don't want to miss that.